The image will not fade from the economic record. A wide shot of the Sir John A. Macdonald Building in Ottawa. On a quiet Tuesday morning in late autumn, the press corps assembled for what had been scheduled as a routine quarterly trade statistics release. The lectern positioned in front of the standard configuration of Canadian flags. The Minister of International Trade was expected to deliver the briefing. The Minister of Finance was expected to take questions. The presentation was expected to last approximately 23 minutes and to be covered, if at all, in the third or fourth section of the business pages of the major Canadian dailies. At 10:04 in the morning, the Prime Minister of Canada walked into the room. He carried no folder. He wore the dark suit that had become his structural signature across every consequential statement he had issued since assuming office. The Minister of International Trade was already at the lectern. Carney did not displace him. He stood 3 paces to the minister's right, hands resting at his sides, and listened without interruption as the minister read the quarterly trade statistics into the public record. The numbers, when they were read, were the numbers that the institutional analysts at Goldman Sachs and the Financial Times had spent the preceding 6 weeks anticipating. Canadian exports to the European Union had increased 47% year over year. Canadian exports to Japan had increased 39%. Canadian exports to the United Kingdom had increased 41%. Canadian exports to South Korea had increased 52%. Canadian exports to India had increased 61%. Canadian exports to Australia had increased 34%. And the share of total Canadian trade flows directed toward the United States, which had stood at 76% of all Canadian exports for the better part of 3 decades, had declined to 51%, the lowest percentage recorded since the original free trade agreement was ratified in 1988. The minister finished reading the statistics. He thanked the journalists present. He stepped aside. Carney walked to the lectern. He acknowledged the gravity of the moment in a single sentence. He looked directly into the camera, carrying the live feed to the financial press centers in New York, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Singapore. And in the unhurried cadence of a man who had spent the preceding 3 years constructing precisely the outcome the statistics had just documented, he delivered the 8 words that have now been quoted in every chancery, every trading desk, and every business school in the developed world. The replacement has occurred. It is now complete. To understand the structural weight of those 8 words, it is necessary to understand the institutional sequence that had produced the statistics the Minister of International Trade had just read into the public record. According to the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, bilateral trade between Canada and the United States had peaked at $891 billion in annual flows approximately 37 months before the Ottawa briefing, with the Canadian share of total American import volumes standing at 14.3%, and the American share of total Canadian export volumes standing at 76.1%. According to Statistics Canada, those figures had declined across 37 months of sustained Canadian diversification to $463 billion in annual bilateral flows, with the Canadian share of American imports standing at 7.9% and the American share of Canadian exports standing at 51.2%. According to Goldman Sachs, the redirected trade volumes had been absorbed across 6 multilateral relationships in proportions that the firm had documented across successive client communications, with the European Union absorbing 34% of the redirected flows, Japan absorbing 17%, the United Kingdom absorbing 14%, South Korea absorbing 11%, India absorbing 13%, and Australia absorbing 7%, with the remaining 4% distributed across smaller multilateral arrangements. The Financial Times had described the diversification sequence in an analysis published in the week preceding the Ottawa briefing as the most extensive sustained reorientation of a single national trade architecture in the post-war era. The Economist had described it as the first documented case of a G7 economy successfully diversifying away from structural dependence on the United States in the modern history of allied commercial relationships. The analytical consensus among the institutional economists at the major American banks, expressed in client communications that had been circulating for approximately 14 months, was that the diversification had reached an operational threshold at which the United States no longer held the commercial leverage that had structured the bilateral relationship for the preceding 4 decades, but that the threshold had not yet been publicly acknowledged in terms that would crystallize the institutional implications. The Ottawa briefing, when it occurred, crystallized those implications in 8 words. The replacement was no longer a strategy. The replacement was no longer a projection. The replacement was a documented operational fact, confirmed in the quarterly trade statistics of the Government of Canada, attested to by the Prime Minister of Canada in front of the International Press Corps, and reported in real time to every foreign ministry and every financial institution in the developed world. What occurred in the 37 months preceding the Ottawa briefing is now being reconstructed by economic historians at four major institutions, and the reconstruction is what makes this episode different in structural kind from every previous shift in the bilateral commercial relationship. According to three officials in the Privy Council office who spoke to the Financial Times on condition of anonymity, the diversification sequence had been initiated not in response to any single American action, but as a deliberate long-term institutional project that had begun in the early weeks of the current Canadian government's tenure, and that had been pursued across 37 months on parallel tracks in 6 separate multilateral relationships. The first track had involved the operational activation of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, an agreement that had been ratified in 2017 but had operated below its full provisional capacity for the entire intervening period. The Government of Canada, in the early weeks of its tenure, had initiated a sustained operational program with the European Commission to identify and remove every procedural barrier preventing the agreement from operating at its full ratified capacity. Across 31 months of coordinated procedural work, 84% of the identified barriers had been removed. The second track had involved the operational expansion of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, an arrangement that included Japan, Australia, South Korea, and 7 additional Pacific Rim economies, and within which Canada had been a founding signatory but had operated prior to the current government's tenure at significantly below the full operational scope contemplated by the original framework. The expansion across the 37-month window had been documented by the Asian Development Bank as the largest sustained operational scaling of trans-Pacific commercial flows by any single member in the agreement's operational history. The third track had involved the negotiation and ratification of a comprehensive bilateral framework with the United Kingdom following the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, an instrument that had been signed in the early months of the current Canadian government's tenure, and that had been operationally scaled across the subsequent 33 months to a flow volume that the Office for National Statistics had documented as exceeding the equivalent flows between any two G7 economies outside of the United States bilateral relationships. The fourth track had involved the operational scaling of bilateral instruments with India, an economic relationship that had been structurally underdeveloped in the preceding decade, and that had been the subject of sustained diplomatic engagement across the 37 months preceding the Ottawa briefing. The fifth and sixth tracks had involved the operational activation of energy export infrastructure and critical mineral processing arrangements that had been the subject of capital investment across the preceding 7 years, and that had been deployed to operational capacity in the final 14 months preceding the briefing. None of these tracks had been pursued in public. None had been the subject of dramatic announcements. None had been characterized by the Government of Canada or by the Prime Minister personally as elements of a coordinated diversification strategy. They had been pursued, in the words of one official quoted in the Financial Times the morning after the briefing, as the routine institutional work of a government that had concluded at the beginning of its tenure that the structural durability of the bilateral relationship with the United States could no longer be relied upon, and that the responsible response was to construct, in parallel and without public characterization, every operational alternative the Canadian economy could sustain. The Ottawa briefing, when Carney delivered it on the Tuesday morning, was structured with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years writing central bank communications that could not afford to be misunderstood. He acknowledged the gravity of the moment in a single sentence. He confirmed for the public record that the quarterly trade statistics the Minister of International Trade had just read constituted the documented operational confirmation that the share of Canadian trade flows directed toward the United States had declined below the threshold at which the bilateral relationship could be characterized as the structural foundation of the Canadian economy. He observed, in the unhurried cadence that had become the structural signature of every consequential statement he had issued since assuming office, that the replacement of that structural foundation had been the deliberate institutional project of the Government of Canada across the preceding 37 months. He observed that the project had been pursued in 6 separate multilateral and bilateral tracks. He observed that the project had been documented quarter by quarter in the standard trade statistics that the Government of Canada had been publishing throughout the period. He observed that the operational threshold at which the replacement could be considered complete had been reached in the quarter that had just concluded. He paused. He looked directly into the camera, carrying the live feed to the international press centers. And then he delivered the 8 words that have now been read into the record of 9 parliamentary committees and quoted in every chancery in the developed world. The replacement has occurred. It is now complete. He repeated the phrase. He let it settle in the room. And then in the same unhurried cadence, he explained what the phrase meant on the surface and what it meant beneath the surface. On the surface, he said, the words meant exactly what they said. The structural dependence of the Canadian economy on the bilateral relationship with the United States had been replaced across 37 months by an operationally diversified architecture of multilateral relationships in which the United States remained an important commercial partner but no longer constituted the structural foundation. The replacement was not a future objective. The replacement was not an ongoing process. The replacement was a documented operational fact, confirmed in the standard trade statistics that the government of Canada had been publishing throughout the period. That was the surface meaning. It was sufficient on its own. But beneath the surface, he said, the words meant something deeper. And the deeper meaning was the reason the statement had been delivered at the standard quarterly briefing, rather than at a special address. The deeper meaning was that the bilateral commercial relationship between Canada and the United States had been characterized by senior American officials across the preceding 3 years as a relationship in which the United States held structural leverage over the Canadian economy on the basis of the commercial dependence the bilateral flows had created. That characterization, he said, had ceased to be operationally accurate at some point in the preceding 14 months and had ceased to be defensible by any standard analytical measure in the preceding quarter. The government of Canada had not characterized the change. The government of Canada had simply continued the institutional work that had been producing the change. The change had now been documented in standard quarterly statistics, and the documentation, he said, would be the basis on which every subsequent commercial discussion between the two governments would be conducted. He closed his statement with a single observation. The government of Canada, he said, would continue to value the commercial relationship with the United States, would continue to honor every contractual commitment to American counterparties, and would continue to pursue, through institutional channels, the bilateral discussions that the integrated continental economy made appropriate. The government of Canada would not, however, conduct those discussions on the basis of an assumption of structural dependence that had ceased to be operationally accurate. He thanked the journalists present. He nodded to the Minister of International Trade. He left the lectern without taking a single question. The entire statement, including the introduction by the Minister of International Trade, lasted 27 minutes and 11 seconds. And in those 27 minutes and 11 seconds, the operating logic of every subsequent commercial interaction between the two governments was permanently reorganized. Warren Buffett, observing from Omaha, where Berkshire Hathaway holds substantial exposure across the rail, freight, energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing sectors most directly affected by the operational reorientation of Canadian trade flows, offered the analysis that has since been read into the record of 3 congressional committees and reprinted on the editorial pages of every major financial publication in North America. Buffett said that in 70 years of observing the relationship between structural commercial leverage and public characterization of that leverage, he had identified one principle that applied without exception to every commercial relationship he had ever studied. The principle was this: structural commercial leverage exists only as long as it is operationally accurate to describe one party as dependent on the other. The moment the operational facts cease to support the description, the leverage is no longer present. The party that had been relying on the leverage may continue to describe it in the public record. The party that had been characterized as dependent may continue to be characterized that way. The characterizations have no effect on the operational facts. The operational facts have already determined the outcome. The public confirmation of the outcome, when it eventually occurs, is the moment at which the characterizations are required to be revised. But the revision changes nothing about the underlying facts. The leverage had ended long before the confirmation. The confirmation simply made the ending publicly visible. Buffett applied the principle with the specificity that has made his analysis required reading in every business school in the English-speaking world. The bilateral commercial relationship between Canada and the United States, he said, had been characterized for at least 3 years by senior American officials as a relationship in which the United States held structural leverage over the Canadian economy on the basis of commercial dependence. That characterization had been operationally accurate as recently as 47 months before the Ottawa briefing. It had begun to lose operational accuracy approximately 30 months before the briefing. It had ceased to be operationally accurate by any standard measure approximately 14 months before the briefing. And it had become, by the quarter that had just concluded, the most analytically isolated characterization being maintained by any senior American official about any commercial relationship the United States was currently conducting. The Ottawa briefing, Buffett said, had not produced the replacement. The Ottawa briefing briefing had simply confirmed that the replacement had occurred. The replacement had been produced by 37 months of routine institutional work conducted by the Government of Canada in 6 parallel tracks, without public characterization, without dramatic announcement, and without any single moment that could have been identified by the United States government as the moment to respond. Buffett identified the deeper structural insight. The American administration, he said, had been operating across the preceding 3 years on the assumption that the bilateral commercial leverage it had relied upon for decades remained available to be deployed in support of its negotiating positions. That assumption had not survived the operational facts. The assumption had not been revised because the operational facts had not been publicly confirmed. The operational facts had now been publicly confirmed. The assumption could no longer be maintained. And every commercial demand that had been issued by the United States administration to the Government of Canada over the preceding 3 years, every threatened tariff schedule, every demanded concession, every public characterization of the bilateral relationship as one in which Canada was the dependent party, had been issued under an assumption that had ceased to be operationally accurate at some point during the issuance. The demands had not failed because Canada had refused them. The demands had failed because Canada had constructed, in parallel and without acknowledgement, the operational alternatives that made the demands unenforceable. He concluded with a sentence that has been quoted on the floor of 3 legislatures and reprinted on the cover of 4 financial weeklies. The replacement has occurred. It is now complete. Carney, Buffett said, had stated the operational fact with structural precision. The replacement had been produced by the operational work. The Ottawa briefing had simply made the work publicly visible. And the visibility, he said, would now compel the revision of every assumption about bilateral commercial leverage that the United States administration had been operating under for the preceding 3 years. The consequences accumulated in waves across the hours and days that followed the Ottawa briefing, and continued accumulating in patterns that institutional analysts across the developed world were still documenting weeks after the original statement. Within 4 hours, the Canadian dollar strengthened 2.7% against the United States dollar. The euro strengthened 1.9%. The British pound strengthened 1.7%. The Japanese yen strengthened 2.1%. Within 24 hours, the S&P 500 declined 3.4%. The Toronto Stock Exchange rose 3.1%. The combined market capitalization of the 7 largest American corporations with concentrated Canadian commercial exposure declined by $103 billion across the 4 trading sessions following the briefing. Goldman Sachs issued a client communication that captured the institutional assessment in a single sentence. The operational fact confirmed in the Ottawa briefing, the firm wrote, has been visible in the quarterly trade statistics for at least 4 quarters, and the public confirmation will accelerate the institutional adjustments that the analytical community has been anticipating across that period. The Business Roundtable, whose membership includes the chief executives of the 11 largest American corporations operating across the bilateral relationship, issued a statement calling for the immediate restructuring of American commercial diplomacy toward the Government of Canada on the basis of the documented operational reality the briefing had confirmed. The National Association of Manufacturers said the assumption of structural Canadian commercial dependence that had underlain American negotiating positions across the preceding 3 years had been definitively documented as analytically untenable, and that the costs of having maintained that assumption would compound across American industrial sectors for the remainder of the current decade. The governor of Michigan said that the automotive supply chains running through his state had been operating across the preceding 18 months under conditions that had implicitly assumed the operational reality the Ottawa briefing had confirmed, and that the explicit confirmation would accelerate the strategic decisions his state's manufacturers had been preparing across that period. The governor of Texas said that the energy infrastructure connecting his state to Canadian supply had been operating under contractual arrangements that had quietly adjusted to the reorientation of Canadian export priorities, and that the publicly documented confirmation of the reorientation would require comprehensive revision of the federal energy planning assumptions on which his state had been operating. The governor of Iowa said his farmers had been experiencing the agricultural input price adjustments that the reorientation had been producing across the preceding 14 months, and that the publicly documented confirmation would require the federal government to address the structural costs his state had been absorbing. The governor of Ohio said his state's manufacturing base had been adapting to the reorientation across the preceding 2 years, and that the publicly documented confirmation would compel the federal government to revise the industrial policy assumptions on which his state's economic development planning had been conducted. A Republican senator from North Dakota said his state's oil production had been integrated with Canadian midstream infrastructure under operational arrangements that had been adjusting to the reorientation, and that the publicly documented confirmation would compel comprehensive federal review of the cross-border commercial framework. A poll conducted by a major news organization within 5 days of the briefing found that 69% of Americans, including 44% of Republicans, believed the administration had fundamentally misunderstood the operational reality of the bilateral commercial relationship across the preceding 3 years, and that 75% of independent voters believed the administration's negotiating positions had been based on assumptions that had been operationally inaccurate for at least the preceding 18 months. The international dimension amplified the operational reorientation in ways that no subsequent corrective action could reverse. 6 allied governments that had been observing the diversification sequence requested briefings from the Canadian Foreign Ministry on the operational framework that had produced the documented replacement. 4 sovereign wealth funds initiated formal reviews of their American asset allocations on the basis of what the relevant fund communications described as the documented impairment of structural American commercial leverage. The European Central Bank circulated an internal memorandum recommending that the structural assumptions underlying the role of the United States dollar in international commercial settlement be reviewed in light of the publicly documented capacity of allied economies to reorient their commercial relationships away from American structural dependence within commercial windows shorter than the preceding 3 years. So here is where we stand. Across 37 months of routine institutional work conducted in parallel across 6 multilateral and bilateral tracks, the Government of Canada reduced the share of Canadian trade flows directed toward the United States from 76% to 51%, increased Canadian exports to the European Union by 47%, to Japan by 39%, to the United Kingdom by 41%, to South Korea by 52%, to India by 61%, and to Australia by 34%, and constructed the operational architecture of a diversified commercial economy whose structural foundation no longer rested on the bilateral relationship with the United States. The work was conducted without public characterization. The work was conducted without dramatic announcement. The work was conducted, in the words of one Canadian official, as the routine institutional response of a government that had concluded that the structural durability of the bilateral relationship could no longer be relied upon. On a Tuesday morning in Ottawa, at a routine quarterly trade statistics briefing, Mark Carney walked to the lectern, acknowledged the operational reality the statistics had confirmed, and delivered the 8 words that have now been quoted in every chancery, every trading desk, and every business school in the developed world. The replacement has occurred. It is now complete. Within 72 hours, the Canadian dollar had strengthened 2.7%, the S&P 500 had declined 3.4%, $103 billion in American market capitalization had been erased from corporations with concentrated Canadian exposure. Goldman Sachs had confirmed that the operational adjustments would accelerate across American industrial sectors. The Business Roundtable and the National Association of Manufacturers had called for the comprehensive restructuring of American commercial diplomacy toward Canada. The governors of Michigan, Texas, Iowa, Ohio, and North Dakota had publicly broken with the White House. 6 allied governments had requested briefings on the operational framework. 4 sovereign wealth funds had initiated formal reviews of American asset allocations. The European Central Bank had begun reviewing the structural assumptions underlying the role of the dollar in international settlement. And Warren Buffett had explained that the replacement had been produced by operational work, and that the public confirmation had simply made the work visible. The questions that remain are now being asked in every chancery, every trading desk, and every legislative committee in the developed world. Can the United States continue to operate on assumptions of structural Canadian commercial dependence that have been definitively documented as analytically untenable when the documentation itself has accelerated the institutional adjustments that the analytical community has been anticipating across the preceding 4 quarters? And if it cannot, what does the Ottawa briefing mean for every commercial negotiation that the United States will conduct with any allied economy whose institutional capacity to construct operational alternatives has now been publicly demonstrated by the Canadian sequence? When the replacement has been produced by 37 months of routine institutional work, and the public confirmation has been delivered in 8 words at a routine quarterly briefing, who is in a position now to dispute that the replacement has occurred and that it is now complete? Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.